Okay, let's turn next to what a demand function is. And a demand function displays the relationship between price and quantity demanded, but at any possible price. And here something else is also important, because we draw a demand function typically such where we have on the y-axis the price and on the x-axis the respective quantity demanded. But technically, whenever we write a demand function as the price equals, as some intercept minus the slope times Q, whenever we write it like this, we call that actually an inverse demand function. So that's an inverse demand function. Well, typically we are not interested in, so in math, whatever you see to the left side of the equal sign, that is what we call the dependent variable. And whatever we see on the right hand side, this is the independent variable. And by the way, of course, you could have written this function also as P equals minus the slope times Q plus an intercept A. I find it, when it comes to demand functions, I find it always a little bit more intuitive to say, when I draw it from left to right, let's start with the intercept, look at the slope, and draw it, rather than first looking at the slope and then searching for the intercept. But again, this is what we call the inverse demand function. Typically, we would argue and say, we are interested in Q, the quantity demanded, as a function of the price. That is actually the demand function. But so this is what we are typically interested in. But it turns out that when we draw it, and later when we introduce concepts like consumer surplus and producer surplus, it's actually still a little bit more intuitive to draw a demand function such that the price is on the y-axis and the quantity demanded on the x-axis. So let's just practice a little bit with demand functions. So we have here 1, 2, 3 inverse demand function. Okay, so the first inverse demand function is P equals 10 minus Q. Whenever we want to get from an inverse demand function to the demand function, all we need to do is we just need to rearrange terms so that we have the Q to the left side of the equation. So if we have this equation, we can rearrange it and we just say, so this is the inverse demand, I call it ID. And then if we convert it, we get the demand function, I just called that D, which is obviously Q equals 10 minus P. Okay, so for the first one, we can rearrange it to get 10 minus Q. Let's take the next example. So the next inverse, what we can see is P equals 8 minus 2Q. So it has a steeper slope. If we rearrange it, first step, let's put the 2Q. Let's add on both sides 2Q. And let's subtract P. Get 8 minus P, that's the first step. And then we divide both sides by Q. And then the demand function would be 4 minus 1/2 P. So this is the demand function, Q equals 4 minus 1/2 P, but whenever we draw it, it's a little bit more convenient to start out with the inverse demand function. So this was again the inverse demand function, and after rearranging terms we get to the demand function, which is this one. Okay, the last one, which is a very flat or relatively flat demand function. So we have the inverse demand function, which is P equals, so it starts at the intercept 4, and then it has a slope of negative 0.5 or negative 1/2 times Q. So now let's rearrange it to get from the inverse demand function to the demand function. So first thing I would do is we multiply both sides by 2. So then we get 2P equals 8 minus Q. And then we add on both sides Q and subtract on both sides 2P. And then we get Q equals 8 minus 2P. And that would be the demand function for the inverse demand function 4 minus 0.5 Q. So again, at this point, what's really important is to see that whenever we draw a demand curve that is reflecting the law of demand and inverse relationship, we typically draw it such that the price is on the y-axis, and that is a little bit counterintuitive to mainstream math, because the price is typically the independent variable. So we want to know, how does the quantity demanded change when there is a change in the price? So mathematically more correct would be to display Q on the y-axis and the price on the x-axis, but it turns out that for graphical illustration purposes it is more convenient to reverse this labeling and put the price on the y-axis and the quantity demanded on the x-axis. And it will be clear later when we work a little bit more with different kinds of examples related to demand, and we also look at certain areas in graphs and do a little bit more advanced stuff. But let's just stop here, and in the next video let's talk about the determinants of demand.